Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murdered three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. If you tuned in earlier and you were becoming enthralled by that story about the Loch Ness Monster, all of our shows are archived at strangethings.podomatic.com, or you can find us on iTunes. Now, today, we're going to be talking about Mysteries of the Everglades. This is Season 2, Episode 28. It's July 15th, 2017. When I first started this podcast, I had no idea we were going to last through the first month. And here we are, first year. The Seminole Indians call it Pa-ha-oke, which means grassy water. The first Spanish map makers, who never even saw the place, called it Laguna del Espiritu Santo, or Lake of the Holy Spirit. A British surveyor named John Gerard de Braham mapped the coast of Florida in 1773, and he called the area River Glades. For reasons known only to themselves, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and Wallace McMullen suggested that cartographers substitute the name river with the name ever. The name Everglades began appearing on maps in 1823. When I was a young'un, the place was called a swamp. Swamps were nasty, and the best thing you could do with a swamp was to drain it and fill it in with dirt so people could build houses and shopping malls. All those pesky animals could just go live someplace else. Well, after a few decades of improvements and developments, somebody realized those swamps were actually a vital part of the planet. Instead of calling them swamps, they began using the term wetlands. It sounds much nicer, and so people felt less icky talking about them. And all those pesky animals, they got on with trying to survive, even though there are people out there who don't know what happens when you introduce invasive species into an area. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. Land. Just about any land, even if it consists of mostly water and mud, is still considered valuable to someone. Back around 1,500 years ago, the Seminole Indians began to build up parts of the swamp by piling seashells up, creating a retaining wall to keep the dirt on one side and the water on the other. Slowly, small islands began to form out of the mud. These islands were usually uninhabited since they sat in the middle of the swamp, and there wasn't much to do there other than fish. People did come and go, sometimes staying a few years, and other times for entire generations. As the United States began to grow and laws were passed to keep people from killing each other, there were those folks that didn't much care for laws, and they were looking for places to hide from all those people they had ripped off. One place they found to be to their liking were the swamps in and around Florida. Lots of places to hide, and no one was willing to slog through the miles of mud looking for criminals. The Everglades became the East Coast version of the Wild West. Sometime in the 1880s, Edgar Watson showed up in Collier County, Florida, a 2,025 square mile swamp with very few inhabitants. He took over one of the many small islands near Chokolosky Island, and he built his cabin on top of one of the ancient shell walls. He raised hogs and he grew sugar cane. He also hunted wild birds to sell their feathers. Watson tended to stay to himself, which was fine by most of the other folks living in the area since a lot of them didn't much like socializing. There were some honest folks living in the swamp, but even they tended to be antisocial. What passed for a town consisted of a supply store and bar and a few houses. Everyone living in the area came and went by boat. On occasion, some stranger would show up in town looking for work and a place to lay low. Aside from fishing, there wasn't a whole lot of work available. The sugar cane fields needed workers, so Watson would take on some of these people for the season. Once the crops had been harvested, these workers tended to move on, or so everyone thought. Edgar Watson had come from South Carolina. Being a stranger who no one really knew, the town folks began to speculate about his past. With time and his lack of social skills, the stories began to build about his being wanted for murder or on the run for some other crime. These were just stories spread from mouth to mouth by people with little to do but gossip. Like any good rumor, the stories grew. Watson either ignored these stories or he never heard them. He was too busy building his small fortune from his sugar plantation. The only time he appeared in town was when he needed supplies for one of his businesses. No one in town could actually say that they knew him. Adolphus Santini got to know Watson a bit too well. An argument broke out between the two men. What the argument was about, no one knows. How it ended was with Watson slashing Santini across the throat with a knife. Santini was lucky to survive the encounter. He lost a lot of blood and some of his dignity, but he never filed charges against Watson. This got the rumor mill going even stronger. People all said that Watson had paid Santini a lot of money to make the whole throat-slashing incident just go away. There were a few other landowners who were finding it difficult to find laborers willing to work in their swampy fields. Mosquitoes were known to nearly carry people away. There were snakes and alligators. The heat was oppressive, and even with sundown, the humidity never let up. Those willing to work were few and far between. These landowners began to wonder why Watson always had people out working on his property. How come he could find laborers when nobody else could? Then the question came up. Why did all of these workers just pack up and disappear once the harvests were done? You'd think one or two would stick around town looking for more work. You'd think once they got paid, the workers would come into town looking to spend some of their hard-earned cash on drinks and ladies of negotiable affections. No, when the work was done on the Watson plantation, the workers all left the area. People began to make up their own stories as to why. Not everyone living around Chokolosky Island worked growing crops. Some were content to fish for a living. Some went fishing as a means of relaxation or a way to put food on the table. On more than one fishing trip, bones were discovered on one of the small islands that made up Collier County, Florida. Someone would go walking through the vegetation and stumble on a skeleton, partially uncovered by the rain. There were no forensics back then. If you found a skeleton, it was a guessing game as to how long the bones had been there. And with that, we're going to take a brief pause, play a couple of commercials, and drink some coffee. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
Are you?
Sorry about that. Wrong button.
Are you?
Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanesa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanesa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. With all these buttons in front of me, it's almost impossible not to hit the wrong one at least once or twice a day. Sometimes once or twice an hour. Anyway, getting back to the Everglades. Watson was always quick to declare the bones were the remains of Indians that had been buried years ago, long before he came to Florida. It was a bit odd that the only locations for these dead Indians was in close proximity to Watson's land. One day, a group of squatters, we call them urban outdoorsmen today, moved on to Watson's Island late one night. The next morning, their bodies were found, all shot to death. Watson said he had no idea how this could have happened, and then he said that outlaws had been seen in the area just a few days ago. With no evidence of guilt, Watson was only questioned but never charged. Hannah Smith worked for Watson. She was probably a combination housekeeper and cook. Her body was discovered floating in the water near Watson's property. When the recovery was made, it was found she had been sliced open as if being field dressed like a deer. Watson said he suspected another employee of his, Dutchy Melvin, had killed Smith and then run away. It turns out that Melvin was wanted by the police for having murdered a policeman. A man, only known as Leslie Cox, was living in Watson's Island. He was one of the many people hired by Watson to work on his plantation. Cox was also an unknown. No one knew where he'd come from or why he'd been hired. October 17th, 1910, a hurricane hit the Everglades. Watson packed his bags and left for Fort Myers. He stayed there during the storm and made friends, kind of, with the local sheriff. Then, when it was time to return to Chocolosy Island, the sheriff was kind of recruited to go to the island and arrest Cox. Watson had convinced the sheriff that Cox was the one who had murdered both Smith and Melvin. Well, the sheriff of Lee County didn't have any authority in Collier County, so the sheriff finally refused to go to Watson's Island. Just checking the archiving. My computer's acting a little strange. Sorry about the pause. Anyway, so the sheriff from Lee County said that he was not going to go out to the island, and therefore he was not going to be able to arrest Cox. Once the sheriff had left, Watson went to the local supply store and he bought some shotgun shells. He said he was going to take care of Cox himself. Watson left, only to return a short time later. A group of the local men met him on the pier. It would seem that they'd had enough, and they wanted to question Watson about all those bodies that kept turning up on his lawn. There was an argument, followed by a bunch of gunshots. Watson managed to catch about 40 bullets into various parts of his body. You could say he was quite thoroughly dead. The posse tied the dead body to a boat, and then they hauled it out to a small island called Rabbit Key and dumped Watson's remains there to rot. Later, the sheriff from Lee County did return, and he sent somebody out to the island to recover the body, figuring they were going to need it for evidence. The sheriff didn't take any of the posse into custody, but he did arrest some of the less than savory individuals hanging out on Watson's plantation. After an inquiry, no charges were ever placed. How many people did Watson kill? Nobody knows. The few bodies found could never be traced back to him. What with the swamp being infested with things that will make a meal out of anyone found in an accessible condition, there's really no way we'll ever know. Lots of people showed up at his place, worked, and then simply vanished off the face of the earth. As for the town, today you can still find Smallwood's store sitting where the original supply store had set. Smallwood had moved to Everglades City back in the early 1900s, and this was the place where the posse had taken care of Watson. The store is now a museum. You'll find all kinds of relics from the past, and if you stay there after hours, you might just see some of the former inhabitants of Everglades City. Paranormal groups converge on the museum in hopes of catching photos of one of Watson's missing workers, if not the man himself. At the far southern tip of the Everglades is what remains of Flamingo. Flamingo was the first settled around 1892 in an area that had formerly been inhabited by the Tusquista Indians. A man named Duncan Brady from New England thought this was a good place to start a settlement. The town received the name Flamingo in 1893 when a post office was opened. You have to have a name for a post office to be built. Back then, flamingos could be seen along the coast in large numbers. Those weird-looking birds with the great big bills and the pink plumage. Daily life there in the Everglades could be rough going. A naturalist named Leverett Brownell visited Flamingo in 1893. He said the village consisted of 38 shacks, all sitting up on stilts. The entire town was infested with fleas and mosquitoes. He said he watched a cloud of mosquitoes so thick they extinguished an oil lamp simply by their mass. He also stated that flea powder was the staff of life. All the cabins had thick layers of soot on every wall from the constant use of smudging pots. The smudging pots were normally used to keep farms from freezing, but in Florida they're used to keep the bugs away. By 1900, about 50 families were living in Flamingo, and they had their own school, courtesy of Monroe County. Mostly they were fishermen and in the charcoal production. As time went on, the people began to converge on the area, hunting for bright feathers to feed the plumage industry. A lot of money could be made to supply women of high society with feathers to adorn themselves. Places like New York and Chicago, where the only bright things were light bulbs. The feather hunters were so bad they even murdered Audubon warden Guy Bradley in 1905 because he got in their way. The people of Flamingo were soon overrun by bird hunters. It didn't take long for the very birds the town was named for to be killed off. This also led to the town dying off as well. The post office closed in 1909, and by 1910 there were only 3 houses remaining occupied. Flamingo had a brief resurgence during Prohibition because it became a haven for outlaw moonshiners. When Everglades National Park was created in 1947, the Flamingo site became part of the park. You can still find foundations from the town. Take 9336 out of Florida City and drive into the Everglades Park. You drive for about 30 miles until you see a sign for the Flamingo City Campgrounds, and the road comes to an end. From there, you'll have to hike through the brush. Be careful. The trail isn't marked well, and you're in a swamp filled with all kinds of beasties, the things that might slither up on you. We'll talk more about that in a bit. In February 1971, Barbara Jean Washington was reported missing from her apartment along with her blue Chevrolet Vega. 18 months later, a survey crew were working through the thick vegetation along the side of US 41 when they stumbled upon a skeleton. It had been there for a while, leaving only the bones behind. The police were called in and the skeleton taken for examination. The victim had died from a gunshot wound to the head. Dental records were used to identify the skeleton as being Barbara Washington. The case was a murder, but there were no witnesses or evidence to point to a suspect. The case was put down as unknown and an unsolved murder. June 1974, a group of hunters were scouring the brush for game when they came upon an old rolled-up carpet. There was a horrendous smell coming from the rug. Now I found myself in a similar situation. I found an old carpet rolled up and dumped on the riverbank. My first thought was to call the sheriff's department. Then I thought, what if it wasn't human? I carefully cut the rope and had a look. It was a dead dog. And boy howdy was he ripe. This is the kind of thing that will make your sandwiches taste funny for a long time. Well, the hunters, wanting to know whether it was human or animal, cut the rope to have a look, and they discovered the decomposing body of a woman. She'd been there for a long time, but there was still enough intact remains to identify her. The police determined that this was the body of a young woman, but a search of all the missing persons reports, as well as all the dental records, turned up nothing to identify her. She had also died from a gunshot wound to the head. December 1974, 2 motorists from Dade County were traveling along US 41. There in the middle of the road was the still smoldering remains of James Revels from Miami, Florida. He'd been reported missing, and, well, now he was found. The man had died from 2 gunshot wounds, and he was then doused with gasoline and set ablaze. The body was identified because one hand had been tucked under the corpse, and this was used for fingerprints. Knowing the deceased didn't lead to any suspects. His death was to join the others as unsolved. July 1977, a group of Indians were out in the brush on the side of US 41, near Alligator Alley. They found a body laying in the trees that had 2 bullet holes in its head. The body was that of Mark Schroeder. As the authorities were beginning the process of building their case, a second body turned up. This one was secreted away in the bushes. There was a gold chain around the neck. Try as they might, this new body went unidentified, and they couldn't determine the cause of death of either of these 2 bodies. November 12th, another skeleton was found in the Everglades. This time it was a female. A month later, December 11th, 1977, a woman's skeleton was found in a field of sawgrass located 40 miles east of Naples and about 70 yards off of Alligator Alley. The only clues remaining at this last skeleton were a t-shirt, a pair of white shoes, and a black pearl ring. Everything else had been removed either by predators or scavengers, or the slow process of heat and wet in the swamp. Authorities were unable to identify this latest body. With so many bodies found in one location, the authorities began to believe there was a serial killer at work. And then the bodies stopped showing up. Finding a serial killer is not like finding a regular murderer. In most cases, the friends and relatives are all questioned. Soon, somebody shows up that had a reason to kill the victim. Believe it or not, most people are murdered by somebody they know. With a serial killer, there are no friends or relatives involved. Then the motive is hard to determine. The victim wasn't killed for money or revenge. There is no argument leading to a violent outcome. The suspect could be almost anyone. The crime has to be solved by collecting clues from each crime scene and compiling them into one big case. Oh, and as far as those profilers from the FBI you see solving all those TV murders, usually the profile looks like 50% of the population. It's a male. He lives in a house, and he drives a car. Well, when bodies stop showing up, clues stop coming in as well. And then, with time, other more pressing cases push the dead into the dark corner of the crime lab. And we're going to take a brief pause here and play a couple of commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show once again. The Collier County Sheriff's Office gets about 400 missing person reports a year, with as many as 20 or 30 people declared missing at any one given time. What has happened to these people? Have they ended up dead like so many of the rotting corpses drugged from the swamp, the victims of violent crime? Were they abducted or just simply runaways? Nobody knows for sure. 8 miles south of Alligator Alley is a 3-acre site which is near impossible to access. There are no roads leading in, and the vegetation is really thick. The ground is muddy, and it makes walking very difficult. In the middle of this area is what the locals call the Ghost City. It had been a Seminole village, but the Indians living there suddenly packed up and left. They left behind their belongings, as well as cooking utensils and pots, canoes, and other valuable items that would have been very easy to transport to a new location. When the village was first discovered, the artifacts were aged at about 1 to 2,000 years old. The folks who were looking into this bizarre town went to the Seminole Indian tribe for answers. The tribe could shed no light on the reason their ancestors had abandoned the place. There were stories relating to the site, and some are very odd. One story is about a group of 30 or 40 Confederate soldiers who had robbed a gold shipment from the Union, and they were hiding out along with their loot. During the night, the robbers were attacked by a band of Seminole Indians who killed all of the soldiers. It turned out the soldiers had made camp on sacred ground, and the Indians had taken offense. This leads to the question, had this been a sacred site, why did the original people build their village there in the first place? Or had it become sacred because of something that had happened while the village was there? As for the gold, it all vanished. Even using metal detectors, no sign of the gold has turned up. There was lots of military gear, and just no gold. Along with the military discoveries, the investigators found equipment used to make moonshine. It turns out, during Prohibition, the Lost City was used to make illegal booze. This had to have been a hard place to work, since there were no roads in to haul all the supplies needed to produce enough to make it worthwhile. But when there's money to be made, people find ways to get things done. The Everglades are a spooky place, even in the daytime. Late at night, they tuck on a whole new level of fright. People have reported seeing ghostly ships sailing along the coast, and sometimes on the inner waterways. These ships are always from the old square riggers you see on TV movies to small, single-masted vessels that pirates preferred because of their fast handling and shallow draft, making escape easier. The reports all say these ships would sail even when there was no wind, sometimes going against the breeze, and they tended to vanish from sight. There is one ghost ship with a history in the area. Back in either the 16th or 17th century, a pirate ship was working the coast of Florida looking for easy pickings. When they spotted a merchant ship, they gave chase and tried to get the sailors to heave to and surrender. The merchant ship's captain believed he could elude his pursuers, and so he tried his best to escape. After a long and tedious day of maneuvering and tacking back and forth, the merchant vessel finally had to submit. Well, the pirates were kind of pissed off after having to work so hard, only to discover there was little of value once they had seized the ship. So they began to entertain themselves by killing off the crew. One by one, they came up with new and nasty ways to dispose of the men. The wife of the ship's captain became enraged by this barbarous activity, and getting down on her knees, she cursed the pirates. The woman prayed that God would vanquish these horrible men. She must have had an in with God, because as soon as she was finished, a huge tidal wave hit the pirate ship, washing it inland into the swampy land beyond and killing all of the pirates. The curse stuck because the crew of the pirate ships were condemned to sail the coast, looking for a port but never finding one. When somebody reports seeing a ghost ship sailing through the waters near the coast, people will refer to this incident from the past. December 29th, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was lining up for the runway in Miami. They were coming in on what, for all intents and purposes, was just a routine flight. The flight crew noticed a warning light that indicated the landing gear had malfunctioned. They began the process of checking all the possible fixes. They were all focused on looking for the landing gear problem, and nobody noticed the autopilot had stopped working. The plane lost altitude and smashed into the ground at full throttle. As the plane slid through the swamp, it was torn to pieces. Bits of the plane and most of the passengers were dispelled into the muddy water. The seats broke loose, and some of the passengers wound up sitting in the grass around the trees, still seat-belted in. Of the 176 people on board, 75 somehow managed to survive the crash. They found themselves in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by muddy water, filled with alligators and snakes. It was midnight and pitch black. The flight attendants quickly assessed the situation, and they began yelling for the survivors to not light any matches or lighters because they were sitting in a sea of jet fuel. Some of the passengers survived the crash only to wind up drowning in the swamp. Robert Marquise, an airboat pilot, was out frog gigging with Ray Dickinson when the plane hit the water. They sped over to the scene and began pulling people from the water. Marquise was injured during the rescue but continued working. He was later awarded the Humanitarian Award from the National Air Disaster Alliance Foundation and the Alumatech Airboat Heroes Award from the American Airboat Search and Rescue Association. The scene was a mess. Bodies were floating in the fuel-saturated water. Bits of plane were scattered throughout the brush. Long into the next day, boats were looking for any survivors or recovering the dead before the swamp creatures got to them. The National Transportation Safety Board needed to find out the cause of the crash. Why did the autopilot get switched off? They enlisted local fishermen and just about anybody who owned a boat to bring in as much of the plane as could be found. Once the cause of the crash was placed on a faulty switch that had been accidentally moved without any effort, the switch should have been much harder to use, but the NTSB found that this switch was not adequate for future aircraft. Once the cause had been found and the bits and pieces of the Airbus were then turned over to Eastern Airlines, the owners of the plane. Now we move away from the Everglades for just a bit. Eastern Airlines decided some of the remains of Flight 401 weren't in bad shape, so they used the parts for replacements on other airplanes. Kind of like going to the junkyard to fix your 1964 Chevy pickup. You can save a lot of money that way. One female passenger on a similar L-1011 Airbus asked the flight attendant about the man sitting in the seat next to her. The man was dressed in the uniform of an Eastern Air flight crew, but he seemed to be very deeply asleep. When the flight attendant tried to wake the man, he simply faded from view, right before both the woman's eyes as well as many other passengers. Later, Everybody agreed the man looked like Captain Loft, the pilot of the crashed airplane. When an L-1011 was being pre-flight checked by the flight crew, a man in uniform told them he had already done the pre-flight check for them, and then he vanished. The crew all said the man had looked like co-pilot Repo from Flight 401. People kept reporting seeing the crew from Flight 401. A quiet inquiry into the reports found that any plane that had been fitted with parts recovered from Flight 401 were the planes where these men were seen. It was as if the flight crew were still trying to keep their plane, or at least pieces of it, in the air. Quietly, all the recovered parts were pulled from service and placed in a hangar. Nowadays, people working in the hangar hear sounds coming from the dark corners, sounds of people talking or crying. The hangar is hot year-round. There is no air conditioning, but certain places are cold. As the workers walk along the shelves looking for parts, they will enter a cold area for no known reason. If you've listened to the shows about ghosts, you've probably heard that spirits will sometimes do this. And now, back to the swamp. Today, people traveling through the crash zone still hear sounds of people in distress. They report hearing people crying out for help. They also hear voices calling to each other, checking to see if their friends and family had survived the crash. This sounds like what is known as a residual haunting. It's like a recording has been burned into the land where the plane came down, and it plays over and over. Hopefully, there aren't any spirits trapped in the swamp. Another oddity found in the Everglades is known as the skunk ape. This sounds a lot like a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, only smaller and smellier. The story of people smelling nasty things whenever a Bigfoot is near is not all that prevalent. Only about 20 to 30% of the Bigfoot encounters have bad smells reported with the sightings. But the skunk ape is always accompanied by what people say is a rotten aroma. The skunk ape, also known as the swamp cabbage man, swamp ape, stink ape, Florida Bigfoot, Louisiana Bigfoot, Mayaka ape, swamp squatch, and Mayaka skunk ape, is a humanoid cryptid is said to inhabit the U.S. states of Florida, North Carolina, and Arkansas, although reports from Florida are the most common. It is named for its appearance and for the unpleasant odor that is said to accompany it. Reports of the skunk ape were particularly common in the 60s and 70s. 1974 sightings of a large, foul-smelling, hairy ape-like creature which ran upright on two legs were reported in suburban neighborhood of Dade County, Florida. The naysayers will try to convince everybody that this is simply a bear. People see a bear standing on two legs, and the next thing you know, it's running through the swamp. Bears do not run on their back legs, ever. Just about everything coming from this skeptical inquirer should be placed in the same file as the regular inquirer. There have been ape sightings in parts of Florida. Back in 1933, they were filming a Tarzan movie in Florida. One story is that the apes were released once the filming was finished. Another says that the apes had escaped. Whichever the reason, there are apes living wild in Florida. We're talking average-sized chimpanzees and orangutan. The skunk ape is considerably bigger, standing around 6 feet tall and walking around on two legs, which apes can do, but they aren't very graceful while doing it. There have also been casts of prints from some of these sightings. The best way to determine whether you've seen an ape footprint or a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot is the shape of the print. An ape has a big toe that sticks out almost mid-foot. The Sasquatch or Bigfoot or the skunk ape all have what looks like a human's footprint, but there is a mid-tarsal break. That's an extra hinge or a flexation in the middle of the foot. We're going to take a brief pause here, play a couple of commercials, drink some coffee, and don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iterbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. So, people are seeing all kinds of evidence of a large, hair-covered beast, or near human, running about in the wilds of Florida, especially the Everglades, where there's plenty of places to hide. Back in the 60s, reports of a half-man, half-alligator were rather prevalent. A man out hunting in the Everglades was attacked by one of these creatures. The creature didn't seem to know what a rifle was, and so the hunter shot the creature in self-defense. He dragged the body out of the swamp and then had it mounted. A man from Washington named Wellington Marsh bought the taxidermied corpse and put it on display in a carnival. There were supposed to be more of these bizarre creatures running around the Everglades, but nobody has reported seeing them in some time. There have been reports from other states like New Jersey, but the Everglades sightings have dried up for now. About 25 years ago, while working a brush fire in the area, a Broward County Sheriff's helicopter spotted a crashed airplane in the swamp. A report was filed, but nobody had a record of any plane going missing in the area. Years later, a researcher took a closer look at the downed plane and discovered it was a TBM Avenger bomber, just like the 5 Navy airplanes that were missing off the coast of Florida back in 1947. Yes, we're talking about Flight 19, which vanished into the Bermuda Triangle. This was the training mission headed up by Lieutenant Taylor. Anyone familiar with the Bermuda Triangle will know about Flight 19 and all the bizarre things that were said and reported that day in December 1947. A subsequent search of the swamp did not turn up the other 4 planes, but this didn't stop folks from saying they'd found the missing planes. Well, at least one of them. The tail, as well as any identifying numbers, were missing. There were no human remains found at the crash site or in the area around it. Now, it is a mystery as to who the crew were and how this one Navy bomber wound up in the Everglades with nobody ever reporting it missing. How could anyone have thought they were out over the Atlantic while flying over the Everglades is beyond me. People will claim that Lieutenant Taylor wasn't a very good pilot. I think not. The lieutenant had 2,500 flying hours and was not just some rookie who didn't know what he was doing. That's 3.5 months of steady flight. Then I read that no other bombers were ever missing in the area. How about the 5 planes found crashed in the seabed just east of Fort Lauderdale in 1991? These planes had all been reported missing on different flights. So, personally, I don't think this plane in the swamp is part of Flight 19. Maybe somebody in records filed the missing plane under the wrong heading. We may never know what really happened to Flight 19, but I wish folks would stop trying to lay the blame on Lieutenant Taylor without so much as a spoonsful of evidence. Now, any swamp is going to be inhabited by snakes. Snakes and swamps go together like peanut butter and bananas. But there's a new snake taking over the Everglades, and it's turning into a very big problem. There are folks out there who like snakes. The bigger the better. And these great big snakes tend to become a big problem when they escape from their pens and go about eating things like other pets and children. Then there's the expense of feeding a creature that gets bigger and bigger all the time. Once Fluffy the Burmese python gets up to around a few hundred pounds, you're going to need a lot of chicken around to keep him happy. Some clowns, as in more than one, decided it would be a good idea to return their giant snakes to the wild. Unfortunately, instead of returning them to the wild of their origins in Southeast Asia, the snakes were turned loose into the swamps of the Everglades. One such idiot turned his or her male python loose, and then some other fool turned his or her female python loose. Nature will always find a way to get the wrong critters together. Mr. and Mrs. Python found each other, and romance was in the air. There are no predators in the Everglades that eat pythons, not even the babies. As the pythons grew, they got hungry, and they ate. They ate anything they could get their deadly coils wrapped around. And the more they ate, the bigger they got. The bigger they got, the more they ate. When a python is on the hunt, it sits in one spot and quietly waits, or it glides along silently just under the surface of the water. Stealth is its best weapon. It senses its prey through sensors all along its snout, as well as tasting its prey with that forked tongue. When anything that might be edible comes into range, the snake strikes fast and hard, latching on with a mouthful of razor-sharp, backwards-facing teeth. There are 4 rows of teeth to clamp on and hold. Then the snake will coil up around its dinner and squeeze the life out of it, literally. By the time the snake has decided whether the meal was something it wanted to swallow or not. Kind of like when you're at the grocery store and you see a chicken or a package of meat sitting in the shelf at the end of the conveyor belt. Somebody wanted it, but then decided no. The snake just might crawl away and leave its squashed dead victim behind. And it's not just pythons. There are boa constrictors, anacondas, and lots of other critters that do not belong in the Everglades, let alone in the United States. Today, the Florida wildlife authorities are trying to capture all of these wild pythons before they eat every living thing in the swamp. Some of the native species of mammals have been reduced by as much as 90%, while the pythons have slowly taken over. Since 2002, the wildlife authorities captured over 2,000 pythons. One was found to have 73 eggs inside, just about ready to be deposited into the swamp. That's just one female python with 73 eggs. I think those rotten objects who released the snakes into the Everglades should be placed in chains and then forced to comb the swamp from one end to the other until every invasive snake has been found. What can be done with all of those snakes? Well, they're already the right shape for sandwich meat. Just slice them up and ship them out. With so many of these giant predators sneaking about, it's no wonder each year so many people go missing while visiting the area. The Collier County Sheriff's Department gets around 400 reports of missing people each year. That's just the one county. There are 3 counties with Everglades wetlands in their jurisdiction. That could come to as many as 1,200 people who vanish each year. How many of them wind up as snake food? I hope not that many, but it is a very big possibility. And with so many native mammal species being destroyed, what do you think those giant snakes are going to do when the food runs out? They're going to start showing up in the rest of Florida as well. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show and we didn't scare you away from visiting the Everglades. If you do decide to go, take a few precautions. Don't walk along not looking at where you're going. Look at where you're about to put your feet. Carry a knife, if not a gun. If a giant snake grabs your leg, you can at least poke him a few times and convince him that you are not on the menu tonight. If you do carry a gun, be sure to not shoot yourself in the foot. Firearms regulations. February 22, 2010, a new federal law allows people who can legally possess firearms under applicable federal, state, and local laws to legally possess firearms in the Everglades National Park. It is the responsibility of visitors to understand and comply with all applicable federal, state, and local firearms laws before entering the Everglades National Park. If you'd like to send us a message, we can be reached at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Our archives are at strangethings.podomatic.com, and we can also be found on iTunes as well as YouTube. We'll be back next Saturday with another enthralling show, so be sure and tune in.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.